Once we've hit 80 people, I think I can start talking. Hello, this is Nate Persley. I'm a law professor here at Stanford and co-director of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. And we are honored today to have Rick Hasen, professor of law at UC Irvine, as well as director of their Election and Free Speech Center, which is the name of which I'm mangling right now. But Rick has probably done more for the field of election law than really anyone living or dead. And I owe him a great debt. And I'm thrilled that he's written this book. It does make me feel that my worlds are colliding, since among the election law types, I've been the one who's been most involved in the internet platform speech area. But it's wonderful to have Rick write such an important book, which is released today, which you can get wherever you get your books. Cheap Speech, published by Yale Press, available on Amazon and everywhere else. And so thrilled, Rick, that you can join us for our Cyber Policy Center seminar today. And anyone who wants to ask a question, please just put it in the Q&A. Rick will talk for the first 15 minutes to half an hour. And then I'll start peppering him with questions, but also want to get as much of the audience involved as possible. So thank you, Rick, for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you to the center. And I really want to say a special thank you to Nate, because when I started this project, it was actually started as a law review article in a symposium in the First Amendment Law Review. Really, the only person in the election law field who was thinking about these issues was Nate. And Nate wrote a really important white paper for the Kofi Annan Institute that I think has gotten not nearly enough attention. And I cite it repeatedly in the book. And I remember when I was pestering Nate to get comments on the book as I was doing a complete rewrite after the events of January 6th, 2021. And I think he sent me an hour and a half of oral comments on the book, which were extremely helpful. So I'm thrilled to be able to open up my set of dialogues on cheap speech in conversation with Nate. And really, I do want it to be a conversation. So I'm just going to extremely briefly sketch out the ideas in the book. And the book, as I said, started off as a law review article focused on the dangers, especially the danger that false and inflammatory speech about elections could lead to actual violence. And by the time I got to the rewrite stage, we had the events of January 6, 2021. So I took the whole manuscript and went off to write for a few weeks and rewrote the entire book to orient it around that, and to start off by making the claim that I think it is extremely unlikely that we would have had the events of January 6th, 2021, with the insurrection at the Capitol, if we had the polarized politics of today, but the technology of the 1950s. So just to take one small example, in the less than 3 weeks between November 3rd and I guess it was November 23rd, after the election, by the New York Times count, Donald Trump went to Twitter 400 times to complain about the election, often with false claims about the election being stolen, with incendiary claims, talking about the need to take the country back, claiming that swing states with cities with large African-American populations were hotbeds of voter fraud. And he was able to communicate directly with millions of people. Imagine Trump in the 1950s trying to communicate these ideas. He would have had, ABC, NBC, CBS, the New York Times, the local newspaper, and a few others, and they would not have given him the ability to repeat these claims unmediated, unfact-checked, and allow them to spread virally. And then, of course, once those claims were out there and they were amplified by groups of people spreading disinformation and spreading this kind of incendiary rhetoric, the rise of cheap speech enabled like-minded people to find each other and to recognize that they were not alone and to organize for political action. And this, of course, happened most prominently, as we know from Wall Street Journal reporting, through Facebook groups. People got organized in the Stop the Steal movement. And eventually we end up with the insurrection at the Capitol, which I believe hasn't gotten nearly the kind of attention for how close we came to actually having our peaceful transition of power interrupted. I think easily you could have imagined a slightly more successful operation, violent operation, that took out some of the leadership of Congress, that took out the vice president, leading to some claim of military control and losing the transition of power in the United States, at least for a period of time. And these events, I think, would have been much, much less likely to have taken place without this technological revolution. And so that's one of the claims that I make in the book. And to frame this, the term cheap speech originated in a law review article written by Professor Eugene Volokh in 1995 in the Yale Law Journal in a symposium on what the internet was going to do. And by cheap speech, what Eugene meant was that it was going to be much cheaper to disseminate ideas without intermediaries. We would have much more information in the palm of our hands. He kind of predicted the rise of things like Netflix and Spotify and all of that. And he recognized that it would lead to an undermining of the traditional intermediaries that people rely upon to be able to judge truth and falsity, especially for my purposes in the context of democratic engagement, politics, and elections. But he thought that people would do well without these intermediaries. And by cheap speech, I mean not just that, but also the fact that we now have an information environment where lower valued speech, cheap speech in that sense, has become predominant, and not just on social media, but also on cable television, just the proliferation of ways, podcasts, the proliferation of ways in which people communicate today. It's really expensive to produce high quality political speech, to produce investigative journalism that holds office holders accountable, for example. That's very expensive, but producing false speech, producing disinformation for not only for political reasons, but for profit has become a major part of our current political ecosystem. And it has created conditions where there are a number of problems that affect our elections and democracy. And this book focuses only on those problems. It doesn't focus on other problems related to cheap speech. It doesn't focus on Section 230 immunity or issues like that more broadly. I'm really concerned with how the rise of cheap speech affects elections. And what I'm going to do is basically three things. One, catalog quickly what those problems are. Second, talk about the kinds of legal solutions that I think would be good and those that would not be good. And then talk about why legal solutions are not enough and the other kinds of things that we need to do. And I should say that if you don't want the full book-length version of the argument, I had a piece in the New York Times yesterday on the general argument. I have a piece today in Slate specifically related to the First Amendment questions at the Supreme Court, and I have a piece that will likely be tomorrow in the Washington Post on private questions of private platforms and the deplatforming of Donald Trump and how the platform should deal with the question of allowing speech that undermines integrity of elections. So first, the catalog of the problems. I already mentioned one, which is increased conspiracy acceptance around elections and the potential for an actuality of election-related violence. And it's not just the events of January 6th, it's also the intimidation of election workers, the intimidation of election and elected officials who count votes. We're seeing this on an unprecedented scale in the United States. And so the kinds of lies that are spread in our current information environment lead to threats of violence and occasionally to actual violence. But that's only one problem. I mean, it's obviously the one at the top of everyone's list, but it's only one problem. Let me list some of the others that I go into detail in the book. Another is the loss of voter competence and decreased office holder accountability as the economic market for local investigative journalism has dried up. You know, the movement from classified advertising and other kinds of advertising in newspapers to Craigslist to Facebook Marketplace, all of that has decimated the economic model of journalism. Journalists have lost jobs faster than coal miners. And as local newspapers have gotten gobbled up by hedge funds and otherwise been taken apart, we've seen the rise of counterfeit news sites, both run by Democratic groups like Courier News, and there's a consortium on the Republican side. We've even seen the Russians through Peace Data trying to get into this. Sites that look very much on the surface like they're local news, but are actually political propaganda or trying to spread incendiary rhetoric. We've seen the rise of foreign interference in US elections. The most obvious example there is the Russian disinformation in 2016. I think there's been a lot of exaggeration about how much that affected the outcome of the election, but it certainly fits very much in our consciousness. A rise in anonymous campaign activity. Nate wrote a lot about that in that Kofi Annan report. I think we see social media exacerbating polarization. Certainly polarization existed before the rise of social media, but there are various features of the current environment that exacerbate that polarization. And importantly, we have high polarization, but very weak political parties. And that comes because demagogues can appeal directly to voters for funds and for support. Someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene would have had a much harder time raising funds if she had to do it in a traditional way. Here, she can say something obscene on social media, and people can, with a couple of clicks of the mouse, give her financial support. There's a bonus to being extreme. And so extreme candidates are favored in this kind of environment, and the moderating forces of political parties that in the past served as important intermediaries to keep our more extreme members of political parties in check no longer have that ability. And then, and I deal with this more towards the end of that first set of materials, the threat of algorithmic manipulation by and through social media platforms. And I talk about a point where during the 2020 election on Instagram, searches for Biden-related content would bring up pro-Trump messages, but searches for Trump-related content would not bring up pro-Biden messages. And this was accorded to be a technical glitch. But I question in the book whether or not there would be anything that would stop a deliberate manipulation in this way, and should there be anything that should stop it. But it is something that needs to be on our radar. So those are the problems caused by cheap speech. Let me mention the legal solutions that I suggest in the book. And my catalog here begins with one that is not a speech-related one, which is just fair election administration, which is that, and this was the topic of my last book, Election Meltdown, the idea is that in order to deprive oxygen of various conspiracy theories, at the very least, you have to run a clean election. And if you don't run a clean election, it's a kind of a miracle that we did run a clean election in the middle of a pandemic. And Nate's work with Charles Stewart and the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project was one component in what it took to try to run a healthy election in the middle of a pandemic. That is just a requirement. You have to have a fair election, or conspiracy theories about elections can run wild. But beyond that, now we get into issues that relate to questions of speech. So on my list are things like improved disclosure of the funding of online political activity. The campaign finance laws have not been updated to deal with online political activity. And so right now, if you're served an ad by watching TV on Hulu, it's subject to different rules than if you're watching it through your cable box. That doesn't make any sense. There are all kinds of political activities related to elections that take place, both domestic and foreign activities, for which there is no disclosure. And I go through and talk about those, how those rules could be updated. This is about improving voter confidence. Similarly, I think that deep fakes should be labeled as altered. Whether they're satire or not, the labeling as altered could give voters some valuable information and make it clear. One of the problems I talk about in the book is that with the proliferation of deep fakes, it's not that people are necessarily going to be taken in by them, but they're going to discount all information they see. And we're going to have a kind of market for lemons where bad information just rises to the top because, we just can't tell what's true or not. And so something like labeling of deepfakes could help. There are various ways we could tighten the ban on foreign interference with elections. I also think that it would be constitutional and desirable to have a narrow ban on false election speech. And what I mean by election speech is speech about when, where, or how people vote. So right now, someone has been indicted and is awaiting trial on charges of falsely trying to get, these were social media messages targeted at African-American voters to get them to vote by text or through social media hashtag. Not clear if current law makes this illegal, but I think it should. That is a very narrow ban. It wouldn't prevent someone from lying about the last election being stolen or making general claims about the election being stolen. So lots of bad speech that has undermined people's confidence would not be covered by this. It also wouldn't cover false campaign speech, where, for example, a candidate lies and says that her opponent voted to raise taxes, but just a narrow ban based on empirically verifiable kinds of claims. I also think that we can have laws that prohibit the micro-targeting of political advertising, which would prevent the kind of piggybacking on private data that social media companies collect in order to target, as Facebook does, lookalike ads towards people who are look like the targets that the campaign itself has identified. We know that these ads are sometimes targeted at vulnerable populations. We know that campaigns talk out of both sides of their mouth with these ads because they are targeted. They can get away with it. We can't expect that counter speech is going to work. I also discussed potentially applying antitrust to break up the platforms if we find that there's not adequate competition and the platforms are not being responsive. I'll come back to that point. But I argue against laws that would require even-handedness, or, for example, Florida's must-carry law that would require social media companies to carry the content of politicians, even those who might undermine election integrity or foment violence. And I think it's kind of ironic, and this is the point of the piece I had in Slate today, that someone like Justice Thomas, who believes even campaign finance disclosure laws are unconstitutional, infringing on the First Amendment, really taking a hardline libertarian marketplace of ideas approach to the First Amendment. Well, here's Justice Thomas out of the box now suggesting that social media companies could be forced, consistent with the Constitution, to carry Donald Trump if they don't want to, analogizing the platforms to telephone companies rather than to something like the Fox News website or the Atlantic website. And I think the platforms are much closer to the latter. They decide to exclude hate speech, pornography. They decide what to promote and demote, and they have First Amendment rights. So I think that the Supreme Court would be an impediment to many of the laws that I propose that I think, under a proper understanding of the First Amendment, should be considered constitutional, or certainly not forms of censorship. Most of them are about trying to give voters additional information, like through disclosure laws. And then finally, and then I'll want to turn it back to conversation with Nate, I don't think law is going to be enough. So what needs to happen beyond law to try to deal with these problems? And the reason I don't think law is going to be enough is, first of all, I'm not confident that in our polarized environment that laws are going to pass. There's a lot of desire to regulate the social media companies, for example, but Democrats and Republicans have different ideas about what that looks like. So what kind of non-legal changes am I talking about? First and foremost, and this will be the subject of the piece I'll have likely tomorrow in the Washington Post, I think we need to pressure platforms into making changes to deal with the serious democracy problems that we face related to cheap speech. So, for example, Facebook, after going to the oversight board, is deplatforming Trump for only 2 years, and it's going to revisit the question. I make the case in the op-ed that's coming out that that ban needs to be extended. And I think we need to be targeting as a public, not under law, but as a public that's trying to pressure companies to do the right thing. We need to be pressuring companies that Spotify or Apple, whoever's doing podcasts, YouTube owned by Google, pressure these companies to be removing election disinformation and to be removing those who are trying to undermine confidence in the fairness of our election process. We also need to subsidize and bolster real investigative journalism. And in the book, I talk about different economic models for trying to make that viable. I point to entities like the Texas Tribune and the Nevada Independent as models of serious investigative journalism that seem to be working on the local level. And then, the hardest ones of all, the ones that there is no quick bullet point to try and do it. We need to strengthen and rebuild confidence in reliable intermediaries and institutions. That's things like using bar associations to go after lawyers that lie about elections. We need to create a private accreditation system for journalists so that we could say you count as a bona fide journalist if you follow these 5 rules of objectivity, and then give those people a seal of approval. And then social media companies can put that seal of approval on media posts that come from these reliable institutions. And that can help to rebuild faith, at least among some people. And then finally, inculcating values of truth, respect for science, and the rule of law. And that, of course, is the hardest problem to tackle. It's the longest term problem. But ultimately, we're going to have to learn to live in this new information environment. Nobody wants to go back to the old information environment. Nobody wants to censor most of what we're seeing. And so the question is, how do we navigate in this very difficult world when there are real world threats to the integrity of our democracy that are being facilitated in part by speech that is undermining our elections? And so striking that balance to have fair elections that people can justifiably have confidence in and still have robust political debate, that is the challenge that we face going forward over the next few decades. And with that, let me ask Nate to turn back his camera.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rick. There's a lot of food for thought there. I'm asking anyone in the 150 participants in the audience to chime in with your questions while I throw out some of my own. So let's start with like the, if you pardon the pun, meta question here, which is how much of the problem here is the rise of the internet, right? How much of it is our politics, irrespective of the internet? How much of it is about the platforms? Because the argument kind of is at all 3 of those levels. And I think, depending on what's the primary culprit here, then the interventions will either have a big effect or not.
Yeah. And so I don't want to say I fudge on that, but I think it's a multi-level answer. We have multiple problems and there are multiple solutions. So we know that political polarization existed before the rise of social media. And polarization was growing before the internet. But we also know that these factors have exacerbated what we already see as a problem. And I'm pulling off the work of Benkler and others. It's pretty clear that it's not just social media that is polarizing people. It is things like cable news. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how when Fox News was not sufficiently repeating the claims of election manipulation, all of a sudden Trump was able to move people over to OAN and Newsmax, which people couldn't even find on their cable channel, all of a sudden was getting hundreds of thousands of viewers. This is part of the same larger cheap speech problem. So it's not really just about social media, these main problems. And I mentioned near the end of my remarks a few minutes ago, the rise of podcasts. Podcasts, we know, are really difficult to study because they're not text-based. And so the same thing with video. And so it's a lot more labor intensive to figure out where this stuff is going and how these things are spreading. But we do know from some recent studies that podcasts and YouTube videos are full of misinformation. So it's coming at you from all different places. And depending on what the problem is. So if the problem is voters don't know who's speaking to them, that may be primarily a problem that is on social media posts. But if the problem is about incendiary rhetoric that undermines people's confidence in the election process, when you're told repeatedly by leadership of your political party that the election is rigged or stolen, that's coming across on every platform. right? And it's getting amplified. And what's different now is that those messages can be made repeatedly and directly to voters in a
Let me
way
ask
that they're
that whether
unmediated.
that last point is so critical or not, because as you're saying, if the president or the candidate for a party is making these kinds of claims, right? That is news, and that is going to get out there. Right?
Yeah.
It's one thing. I mean, I do want to focus on what. Let's break up the problems here a little bit as to what you think is most democracy endangering. But if you have, leaders of political parties, right, or office holders who are engaging in misinformation, hate speech, and incitement from the top down, right? That's a very different phenomenon than the kind of organic democracy, or democratic form of expression that we think is characteristic of the internet, right? And so, if the problem is an elite phenomenon where you have the leaders of political parties engaging into it, that does not sound to me like a technology problem. Sure, it's possible in the days of Walter Cronkite that they may have essentially fact-checked the elites and had a better ability to do so, right? And that Trump wouldn't be able to have 400 tweets in effect or 400 modes of communication to the mass public. But it's still the case that it's not as if it's just one speaker and then it's change of preferences in the mass public. The entire Republican conference, right, was unwilling to take on Trump, really, right? And so that if you're trying to identify what's changed here and whether technology is to blame, it would seem to me that the impact of leadership speech is not the best example, right? It's going to be more on the kind of the non-traditional forms of expression.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to push back on that and disagree. And I'm thinking somewhat of the reports that Stanford and others did about the super spreaders of misinformation and the network of elites that were able to go directly and repeatedly with their arguments. Yeah, if Trump gave 400 press conferences between November 3rd and November 23rd, they were not going to be covered on old TV, right? They were not going to get the same kind of resonance, and they were not going to rile people up in the same way. Now, yeah, sure, it's possible Trump could hold rallies and it would be covered, but the information environment is so different because right now you see something that you like. It's the same thing with donations, and I think back to Barack Obama when he was able to, every time he said something, people could easily send him $5, right? This was the campaign finance revolution that we saw, in the last decade. And now it's spread the vitriol, with just a click. And then not just that, use that to organize for action. And so, I quote some of these oath keepers and others who are, basically see the Trump tweet that says, come to Washington, it's going to be wild. It's like, all right, we're ready to organize. We've taken our marching orders. And now we can find each other and we can organize and we can go and try and engage in this kind of action. So I do think that the barriers to that kind of organization have been sufficiently lowered that the risk is much higher. And the ability of elites to be able to talk unmediated really matters. I mean, there's a huge difference between, a political candidate going on Face the Nation or Meet the Press and a political candidate that just says anything unmediated in a YouTube video. And so I do think that someone like Trump has much more power today to be able to craft a message and be able to organize for political action of the masses than they could have in the prior period.
You raised campaign finance, and I wanted to sort of save this to the end, but since you raised it, let me talk about it there. One argument that has been made, right, is by me and others, is that the move in McCain-Feingold and BCRA, which relatively sort of punished the political party institutions, removed one of the counterweights, one of the intermediary institutions that might have been able to serve the purpose that you're talking about. Now, I mean, obviously you're a big I don't want to overstate it, but I think it's fair to say that you were a fan of that law, and I think pushed back on this argument. What do you think that there's something to it that maybe the part of the hollowing, because you talk about rising partisanship but weak political parties, one argument might be is that they're relatively poor as compared to outside groups, so they can't perform that kind of intermediary role that they did historically.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that argument now. And in part, it's not because McCain-Feingold was flawed. It's because the Supreme Court killed half of McCain-Feingold. They kept the part that decimated political parties. We still have the part of McCain-Feingold that limits the ability of parties to collect soft money. But outside groups can basically do anything. The Citizens United and not just that case, but the whole. So we have this, and this is true going back to Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976. Congress passes a plan. They look at a comprehensive plan. They say contribution limits and spending limits. The Supreme Court says, no, you get half of that. And then we get these perverse results. But I do think, more to your general point, I've become much less concerned about campaign finance problems, not because I don't think they're problems, but because they pale in comparison to the risk of election subversion that we face in the current United States today. And so, as you know, I've been writing the election law blog since 2003. And for many years, campaign finance was one of the top topics I cover. Now I could go weeks without even mentioning a campaign finance story. I mean, the stories are about, the president was trying to pressure the leadership of the Pennsylvania legislature to get them to declare alternative slate of elections. I mean, it's the kind of thing where if I transported you from 10 years ago to now, you would just think it was like, this is not the United States. Our problems with our democracy are so dire right now. And this, I think, takes us a little afield from cheap speech, but more towards the risks of election subversion and stolen elections in the United States. We're in a precarious position. So I don't feel like we have the luxury to worry as much about the kind of traditional things like campaign finance, the influence of large donors on parties, and on office holders than that we used to.
I agree. I think that's right, and I think you're right if you look at the way that people are talking about it. But now let's convert that into sort of what might be the campaign finance version of your argument. I don't want to call it. Let's call it campaign speech and advertising version of your argument. How much of this is a problem of I don't even want to say large financial interests so much as that there are financial incentives that you are viewing as lurking behind some of the disinformation marketplace in a certain sense. And so how much of this do you think can be solved by things like disclosure of online ads or trying to deprive problematic websites of an account of monetization and things like that? How much of that is a financial issue?
Yeah, I would say that this was one of the most surprising things to me because, you work much more in this area generally than I do. But so as I entered this field, to recognize how much misinformation related to elections is not being done primarily for political reasons or only for political reasons, but also being done for financial reasons. That was just the story, I think it was in today's New York Times, about InfoWars and how they were basically taking in $55 million a year in selling supplements and body armor and all kinds of things as they were promoting these, disgusting lies, many of them about election integrity. And the monetization is a huge problem, and as is a model where I talk about this. This connects this market for lemons idea, pulling on the arguments of Nobel Prize winning economist George Akerlof about problems with information markets where voters don't have adequate information. It's worse than the used car market that Akerlof described in his writing, because there's actually demand for disinformation and misinformation now. People want to be served this, and it's profitable to do that. So if somebody goes onto YouTube and they watch a video about the election possibly being stolen, they'll be offered more and more extreme content, which is being monetized for people who are producing it. I think in part this is a much larger problem than the problem of technology. To go back to your earlier point, I think of this as a problem where, take the Trump supporters who are, say, older, white, rural, conservative voters who feel like the American system is changing, passing them by, and they're looking for answers as to why there are these cultural shifts, why there are these economic shifts. And they want easy answers. And so there's a demand for something that will explain away problems that in a way that will validate what they already think. And then once the demand is met, there's more demand. And so more of this is produced, and it creates a kind of bad cycle. Now, disclosure is not going to solve most of that problem, but disclosure can help on the margin. So if you take Benkler's idea that there's, say, 25, 30% of the population that is essentially unreachable with facts, that still leaves a good 20, 30% of people who are open to facts. And so I think if you know that these are not Black activists, but Russian workers in St. Petersburg that are trying to convince you not to vote for Hillary Clinton, or you know that they're not Baptist teetotalers, but in fact, Democratic operatives that are trying to convince you not to vote for Roy Moore in the 2017 US Senate race, to use an example on the other side, you're going to be more skeptical of that message. We know from social science studies that people evaluate messages, political messages, in part by knowing who's behind them. That's why in California, we have these pretty good disclosure laws. And there was a proposition on the ballot about a decade ago involving whether public utilities could compete with private utilities, and it was bankrolled by PG&E. And even though PG&E spent, I think, 30 million to 1 million on this, the measure went down. And I think it's because every ad that appeared on TV and radio said paid for by, and included Pacific Gas and Electric. And so people want that information. And it's much easier to get that information outside the context of online advertising and related content than offline, than TV ads, radio ads, newspaper ads, because the legal regime has not been changed. In the early 2000s, there was this movement, hands off the internet, that really led to this, I think, stymieing of the ability to provide voters with the information that they need.
Let me ask you a little bit about this kind of supply and demand question, because there are really two sets of problems I think you're identifying, maybe more than that, but maybe two dynamics. One is that you've got the internet and new technology and cheap speech facilitates organization among, let's call them extremists, or sort of small groups of people who otherwise would not have been able to connect with each other in the legacy media universe. That's one. The second, and this goes back to your 30% versus 70%. The second possibility is, all right, there are people who are not participating, not necessarily politically active, but boom, something happens with communication on Facebook, that now they're exposed, and so then they start going down either the conspiracy route or they are somehow going to be exposed to cheap, bad speech that will persuade them, whereas previously they wouldn't have. Right? Those are two very different dynamics, and the interventions are going to be different, because it's not clear to me. When you talked about the demand, right? What you say about YouTube is really contested. I'll say certainly from the YouTube folks, as well as the social scientists who look at this, how much going down the rabbit hole is actually happening on YouTube because of algorithms. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that at least the recommendation system, if anything, is shifting people toward the more moderate content, as well as on the election subversion stuff where they actually do takedowns. And so, but if you ask folks from there or any of the platforms, they wrestle with this question: what should they do if you have, whether it's, InfoWars might be the extreme case, but take your more moderate, the kinds of claims of just a video that says the election system is rigged. Okay, and there are millions of those, right? What should the platforms do with those kind of videos, right? And it just says, look, you can't trust the elections. The election is rigged. Should they take those down?
Yeah, so I think that is one of the key questions. And first, I would say that you really want to target this to serial offenders. those who have the most influence and those who have a proven track record of lying about these kinds of things. And in my view, contrary to Justice Thomas, is that the platforms have the full First Amendment rights to decide what material to include and exclude. I certainly think that prominent content that spreads false information should be removed. And at the very least, it should be demoted, and it should not be promoted and there should not be a way to monetize that kind of.
Let me sort of cut you off, but let me make, because I want to get to the audience questions also, but let's, so that's a very important statement you're saying, that you sort of, the pathological liars will I'm caricaturing it here, but people who have a tradition of serial offenders, is I think what you call them, then we should think about their claims in a different light than others. And so the election rigging claim, which has been made in one sense or another by Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, and Joe Biden, okay, in the last few years, should we take down all three of those claims, or should it be based on the history of those speakers?
So I don't think that either Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren, who've used the term rigging, mean it in the same way of a stolen election.
Great. Well, all right. So at the risk of sounding like a prosecutor here, I think you're right. But then the question is, what do the platforms do? Right?
Yeah, right.
Because
so I would say this is what I mean about a track record of falsity. So saying, there were 10,000 ballots dumped in a ditch, the kind of claim that Trump would make. Or we know in Philadelphia that, the ballot boxes were messed with. And these have been proven false. And someone has a record of making repeated empirically falsifiable claims. That's the kind of stuff that I think deserves to be removed if it's by someone who is prominent and not promoted or capable of monetization. And if you go after the recidivists, then because we know that a lot of this information flows top down, again, back to the elites versus the masses, you're going to cut off a lot of the oxygen for these claims. And so I think it matters that Trump has been off Twitter and Facebook, and Trump is still making these claims. Every once in a while, you'll see a tweet from Liz Harrington, who's his spokesperson, where it's basically his tweet in a screenshot, and it just doesn't have the same resonance, and so it doesn't get the same kind of coverage, doesn't get the same kind of press coverage. I think those are the kinds of decisions that the platform should be making.
So I want to dig into this vein a little bit. So you worried about algorithmic manipulation at the front end, right? Where you're talking about the problems, but here you essentially want more algorithmic manipulation, right? In favor, I guess, algorithmic manipulation in favor of democracy versus manipulation that would be harmful to democracy. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that is fair.
All right, and so
I don't think there's a neutral algorithm. You're gonna have to make choices no matter what.
Yeah. But let's talk about the Trump takedown, and then I want to get to the audience questions. So the Trump takedown, is it your view that even if he declares for president right now, that he's going to run for president right now, that he should still be kept off the platforms?
Absolutely, and that's the main point I make in the piece that'll appear likely tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah, so I go on.
I was going to say you can look at Facebook's own standards. So I think it was Nick Clegg had a post where he said, they basically were on remand from the oversight board, and they said, when the oversight board said, "Tell us what your standard is and what your punishment is," and they said, "Here's our standard for, if he is still a risk to the integrity of elections, et cetera, et cetera." I don't have the exact language in front of me, and I think if you apply that standard, their own internal standard, you'd say he's still a risk. He's still saying the same things. He's still trying to undermine the election. He's still calling for decertification of the 2020 election, which is not a thing. So I think it's an easy case to keep him off. I don't care how newsworthy he is undermining democracy.
No, I'm not even talking about the newsworthiness, although that I could see that argument. But if you have the nominee of the Republican Party, you're saying that the American social media and internet companies should essentially deplatform one of the candidates who is running for president, but not the other. How does that not the same concerns that you had, say, when you're talking about Citizens United and the power of corporations to manipulate the election marketplace. Isn't that exactly what we're talking about here?
Well, so the first thing I would say is that, my side lost in Citizens United, and corporations get to spend their money and promote whatever candidates they like. And there's no reason to treat social media companies different from that, unless you're going to argue that they somehow are public utilities or monopolies or something like that. But they can do whatever, just like General Motors can decide we're supporting this candidate for president. So could a social media company, I think, if they're transparent about it. But I think the more important point is that Trump is hopefully an aberration, and that the ordinary Republican candidate in the future is not going to be someone who is going to be spreading election lies and trying to undermine confidence in the fairness and integrity of the election. And so when you've got an extreme case, you've got to deal with it. And you can't shy away from it and say, well, for the sake of even-handedness, we're going to do this. Now, would the social media companies buck under pressure and actually put him back on? Probably. But I think that would be the wrong thing to do.
We're going to have a series of papers, and you are invited now to submit one at the Project Program on Democracy and the Internet on precisely that question. So I look forward. You just expand your article. You've already got it written. All right, let's turn to the audience questions. There's so many of them, and I'll try to group them. I think let me start with Daphne Keller's question, which had to do with the barrier, the sort of Supreme Court barriers. Here's how she asked it. Many of the proposals would need the Supreme Court to depart from the current case law, right, in order for some of them to squeak by. Which proposals seem most plausible for the current court to accept? Which seem least, she asks.
So I think there's a very good argument that a law that would make it a crime to lie about when, where, and how people vote, what I call empirically falsifiable false election speech, telling people you can vote by text, that would be upheld. And I would point to a 2018 case called Minnesota Voters Alliance versus Mansky, where the court said that. Under current law, I think expanding the disclosure laws to cover ads that are served on social media and otherwise, that should be constitutional. But we saw in the Supreme Court's most recent decision in American for Prosperity Foundation versus Bonta that the court is moving away from disclosure. So I think the disclosure laws are uncertain. Also, a requirement to label deepfakes as altered runs into the compelled speech doctrine. I think there's in the book, I make all the arguments I think that the Supreme Court should accept, but kind of in order of they're less likely. And I think something that would ban micro-targeting, either just in political, for election related advertising or across the board, would have a really hard time being accepted. And then where things are really up in the air is this question of laws requiring even-handedness. I think it's kind of interesting that you've got Justice Thomas and Erwin Chemerinsky, at two polar ends of the political spectrum, calling for something like a fairness doctrine revival. And I would have thought that the Supreme Court would have said, no way, we're not going there. But things are all jumbled now. You've got, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Thomas talking about opening up the libel laws, as Trump was talking about. I mean, it's the normal kind of alliances or positions that we would expect liberals and conservatives take on the First Amendment seems to be shifting along with the technology. I wouldn't have expected Eugene Volokh or Justice Thomas to have all of a sudden thought that private social media companies could have must-carry provisions, but that's where we are right now.
Yeah, and I eagerly wait. We don't even have a full majority opinion on any of those issues yet, but it'd be interesting to see. Can we just talk about micro-targeting for a second? So micro-targeting is not unique to the internet, right? And so how bad really is it? And it doesn't, is the problem that the bad use of micro-targeting, or is micro-targeting in and of itself something that needs to be regulated and is inherently problematic?
Yeah, so I think we don't know a lot. And so let me point you to, if there's one law we should pass, it's the Nate Persily law, which would give greater access to social science researchers to be able to see what's going on under the hood of these companies. We know that Facebook cut off NYU researchers who had been looking into certain things. So I do think we don't know enough. But what I say about micro-targeting in terms of social media, and particularly what I focus on, and you were very helpful in helping me think through this as I was writing the book, is the lookalike feature on Facebook. So it's one thing when the campaigns pick their favorite people that they want to send a message to. I see no problem with that. But when people have given up their private data at a level that they don't recognize in order to be profiled by these companies and then used as a kind of lookalike feature to go after them, I say it's like the difference between taking a photograph of someone and being able to have a mind reading machine. And so I do think that the amount of data that's collected by the social media companies is so different in kind than what had ordinarily been collected by political operatives in the past, like what's your zip code, what's your gender, how old are you, that I do think it presents a greater problem in terms of people's autonomy. I know that privacy advocates, I'm thinking, for example, of the work like Julie Cohen at Georgetown, they think that primarily these election issues should be solved not through the First Amendment, but through privacy laws, laws that would prevent, and maybe that is the way. And there's stuff happening now in terms of how Apple is now regulating privacy and how Google is talking about dealing with cookies. I don't know if this is going to change. I'm not a technologist. I don't know if this is going to change enough the nature of what information is going to be available to these companies. But under the current system, I think it's a different kind of problem than micro-targeting that happens outside of the context of use of social media data.
Well, but the problem is the amount of information that then it is available to the targeter, right? And so I think you're right that Facebook and Google, right, sort of increase the capacity to do that. But what's happening also is that there's an industry, right, of information brokers now. And so that if you do cut off their ability to do that, that's developing in parallel with what the platforms have. So whether you want to get at someone with direct mail or email or through Facebook, now you've got other intermediaries that are going to do that. I mean, it is constitutionally, it is an interesting question as to whether you can effectively prevent the ability of, a campaign to selectively target certain groups of people. So take something like, can you on the one hand prevent demobilizing messages targeting African Americans, right? So you're trying to either send them either false or just demobilizing, polarizing information, whereas micro-targeting to mobilize them should be okay, right?
Yeah, I talk about that a little bit in the book, and I think that's totally unworkable, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of talk about not allowing messages that are voter suppression. And that term is often not defined, and it's just too vague. One of the
but you're going in that direction, right? I mean, when you talk about and this is where I wonder whether the false information about the election itself, the voting infrastructure, whatever, texture vote being the
yes.
How big a problem is that versus the other kinds of disinformation, right? It's like. Yeah,
it's relatively small, and that is why it's a problem. So, and this goes back to Daphne's question, that is, the things that we can do are only moderately helpful, which is why I think that law, but consistent with the First Amendment and consistent with what we'd want. And so this is what I got a lot of pushback from people who read the draft manuscript who want more regulation. I say, you want more regulation? What if it's Donald Trump's internet administrator that is deciding whether something is voter suppression or is false speech? It's really dangerous to give government officials the ability to censor. And so
why isn't it just as dangerous to give Mark Zuckerberg that power, right? So that if you're worried about, if the problem here is the outdated First Amendment law that you think is wrong, that's one thing. But if you say the government shouldn't exercise its power, but the platforms should, aren't you concerned about that as well?
So I'm much less concerned about that because I believe that, I'm much less concerned about that assuming we have a sufficiently competitive marketplace, because then I think that consumers can demand that certain things be done, and that when there is bias, there can be exit and there can be voice, right? There are ways to try to deal with this. If the answer to that is, well, no, Facebook is just too powerful because of network effects or whatever, then we have to talk about, well, maybe then the solution is antitrust or something else. Maybe Facebook can't own Instagram and WhatsApp or whatever it is. There need to be alternative means of communication. So long as there's a competitive marketplace among these private companies, I would much rather the private companies respond to public pressure than have a government bureaucrat decide under something like the fairness doctrine how we're going to regulate speech about elections in the country.
Well, except that the public pressure, right, is coming from both sides here, right? So that then I mean, one of the interesting things, we're talking about the Section 230 debate, but this is true for internet regulation generally, is that the Democrats and Republicans both hate big tech. They just hate it for different reasons. Right?
Exactly.
And so it's not clear to me that, responding to public pressure necessarily has the beneficent effect. I mean, in many ways, that's what Facebook has done, right? Which is that they've tried to thread this needle. And it often means that they're, going to be leaving up some speech that I think you think should be taken down.
Right. So the question is how they strike that balance. And so they experimented with these labels, which I talk a lot about in the book. And I think we probably agree that that was a failure in some ways, it might have actually promoted the speech and given it more prominence. But I think deplatforming was absolutely the right thing to do. And I'm someone who believes that that should only be done in the most extreme circumstances. But I just think we happen to go through the most extreme circumstances, at least I hope that the most extreme that we'll see in our lifetimes in the United States. At a moment like that, it is up to all companies, including social media companies, to step it up.
And so should Trump be deplatformed from cable news as well?
Well, if you look at someone like Jake Tapper, who is not bringing on to his program those who voted to object to the votes from Pennsylvania after the insurrection already took place, I think there's a good argument for that. I do think that cable television is different because there's mediation there. It's not public access where someone just goes on and says whatever they want unmediated. They're going to be interviewed.
Well, it could be on some cable channels, right?
They could be, right. But I think to the extent we're talking about something that is mediated, I think there's a greater argument for actually engaging in that discussion. So, for example, Bill Barr, a controversial attorney general, has just been interviewed on NPR and on NBC. And at least there's a chance, you might like him, you might not like him, but at least there's a chance to question him and to push him in a way that if a message is coming out directly to voters, there is not that opportunity.
All right. Well, I feel like we've only scratched the surface, but that means everybody's got to buy Rick's book to hear the full argument here. And we'll have you back. Like I said, we're going to be doing this conference on the deplatforming of Trump in a few months. So hope you can join us for that as well. Thank you to Haifa, David, and Michelle again for organizing this webinar as with every week. And thank you so much, Rick, for joining us. We have our last winter webinar is next week, which is looking at crypto asset regulation with Aman Nair from the Center for Internet and Society and Valerie Shen from Third Way. Kelly Bourne of the Hewlett Foundation, I believe, is going to be the moderator for that. So go out and buy cheap speech. Not only is the speech cheap, the book is well worth your money. So it's valuable speech. So thank you again, Rick. And everybody follow Rick on Twitter and check out the election law blog. It's an incredible service to the profession. So thanks everybody for joining us. See you next week.
Thank you, Nate.